And I should say my topic today isn't really explicitly Misesian. I'm talking about public choice today, although I do think it is consistent with Austrian economics, and Austrian economists have certainly made contributions to public choice. Mises quite often focused on informational issues and would grant his opponents in a debate the incentive issue. It wasn't that Mises denied incentive problems with political solutions to, or political policy interventions. It's simply that he was taking the debate a level higher, such as in socialist calculation, where it'd say, okay, I'll give you your assumption of new socialist man, but then we're going to actually go into talking about economic calculation and show even with the best angels running it, they lack the knowledge necessary in order to do the calculations that would get the outcomes. That's not to deny that, of course, there were massive incentive problems in socialist systems. It's just showing that even if you grant that, it still can't work. That said, I think some of Mises' other writing certainly has public choice aspects in it. And certainly Hayek, when he's writing The Road to Serfdom, has plenty of this, and many subsequent Austrian economists have as well. Just doing good applied political economy, really the game is focusing on both incentives and information. So when someone proposes a solution of how they are going to order everybody else's lives, two questions that need to be asked are, how are you going to get the knowledge to do this? This is what traditional Austrian critiques about how well the market generates knowledge through the price system versus how poor the central planning mechanisms are. And the other question you have to ask is, even if you have the knowledge, will the people who are there have the incentive to go ahead and do it? And that's really more in the public choice realm. Public choice itself is the economic analysis of politics. It's like Austrian economics, methodologically individualistic. So compared to political science, at least a lot of political science, and compared to sociology, when economists do public choice and analyze politics, we don't say the government acts, the United States country acts, society chooses. Individuals who are in the government choose, and they choose based on perceived costs and benefits to themselves. Now, that's the basic assumption that public choice economists use when they're analyzing government. It's not all that radical, though. It's the same assumption economists use when they're analyzing everybody. The anomaly was, before the public choice revolution, which really came about for the most part starting in the 1960s, before then, and even quite a while after, and still bad economists today, will often say there's a supposed market failure in something, so government will come in and fix the problem. Government will do X, without asking what are the incentives and information faced by the government actors themselves, and how are they going to perceive costs and benefits to themselves, and are they actually going to do what this supposed optimal fix would be? That's what public choice gets there and does. Basically, when we look at the guy who's the used car salesman, we assume that he acts based on costs and benefits to himself. Why all of a sudden, once he gets elected to Congress, when Mr. Smith goes to Washington, does he suddenly sprout wings and become an angel? Instead, he's the exact same person he was before. He doesn't become somebody new. So public choice just asks for consistency in our assumptions. When we analyze their actions in the market, the same people should be analyzed with the same assumptions when they start operating in the political arena, whether they're going to be the politician himself, a regulator, a bureaucrat, or a voter. Now, that doesn't mean that we're all of a sudden assuming everybody is selfish. Just that they act on perceived costs and benefits to themselves, but what they view as costs and benefits could be vastly different between individuals. It doesn't mean that all politicians are money-grubbing scumbags who just want most money for themselves. Might be, but it doesn't necessarily mean that. It just means that whatever things they view as benefits to themselves, they're going to try to pursue. Among these benefits could be things like the general welfare, the well-being of others, all sorts of things. In fact, the same assumption we use for the politicians here and the regular citizens in the economy we use to analyze Mother Teresa. She had very selfless, in terms of selfishness type thinking, aims that she was striving towards, but that just meant what she perceived in costs and benefits, how many children she could help. That's what she was viewing as a benefit, and that was in her self-interest. So we're not assuming narrow selfishness, just that people have goals, people have different ends, and they're going to work to maximize those while minimizing the cost to themselves. So unless it's the case that all politicians have a single one and only thing they view as a benefit, the public good, it means the other assumptions of how people, if you took God forbid, if you took a high school civics class, you probably were taught things about one of my friends calls the dancing bill notion of politics, of how it originates in the House and goes in the Senate too, and then they have a joint committee that talks about it, and then the president signs it into law and then enforces it, and then the Supreme Court interprets it, and the bill kind of dances all around Washington with smiley faces everywhere, and society's better off. I wish that course could just be eliminated from high school curriculums across the country. So public choice goes in and instead asks, what are the nuts and bolts of how this process operates? How do the actual people, as they're interacting on these perceived costs and benefits, generate outcomes different than the dancing bill? So if it's the case that the politician doesn't just view the general interest as the only good, but among other things might value prestige, power, money, chances at re-election, adoration, certainly I've seen many politicians who just love basking in the public glow, then maybe they'll do things that they know aren't in the public interest to start benefiting some of these other interests that they have. And thinking like a good economist, we know people have lots of different ends. And people don't make all or nothing trade-offs. They make trade-offs on the margin. So they're going to do a little bit more of this or that. So they're not going to just promote the public good. They're going to do a mix of these things. Sometimes they might do things that are towards the public good. Other times, they might not. So this really kind of revolutionized the way economists start thinking about policy then, because it's not enough to say something is a market failure, which I think is problematic, and we can get into different notions of what failure means. Like it's not a failure of the world that there is friction, and that physicists can walk around and write about frictionless environments. It's just a feature of the world. So too with many of the market failures in economics, so-called failures in economics, is an economist gets writing on the blackboard and keeps going, and he turns around and he looks out the window, and my friend actually, he calls this the oh shit theory of regulation, because they look out the window and the window doesn't look like my blackboard, therefore there is something wrong with the world. Which is kind of peculiar, and then it's, oh shit, we must fix it. So we have to be careful when we're talking about market failures generally, but even if there were such a case, then it used to be the presumption was just, therefore government should fix it. What public choice calls in is a comparative institutional question, say, can it fix it? So let's look at when government actually tries to do what you wrote on your blackboard they should do, will they actually do that, or will they end up doing something else entirely? So given that we have government actors with these different ends, if they're going to do the public good, what could ensure that they do the public good? One of two things. They could sprout rings and become angels. What else would make them do the public good?
It's also in their best interest.
If it's also in their best interest. So how might we make it in their best interest?
Saying the right
Shoot up a hand, somebody. Yeah, in the back. Through the election. So that's the predominant way that we discipline politicians in the United States. We say, you like this being in power, and I think that might be a main motive of a lot of these people, is just they love power. But they certainly love lots of other things too. If you want to stay in this position, whether it's because you love power, the prestige, the money you can make doing it, or because you want to try to do the public good and you need to be in this position to do it, we say, all right, if we're unsatisfied with you, we're going to put you into an election and punish you for not doing the public good. The question is that a very good disciplinary device, and what type of outcomes can we get from it? So I want to do a little exercise with you quickly. All of you pull out one piece of notebook paper. You don't have to write your name on it, but pull it out that you can hand in to me. Some blank or worthless piece of paper in there, maybe your lecture notes from Tony's lecture. Hey, cut the chatter. Just pull out the piece of paper. Single blank piece of paper.
Hey guys, the letterhead in your notebook is for thank you notes to your donors, so try and find something else.
That is not worthless. Maybe a US dollar.
Somali dollar.
4 cents.
This is worth something. It's not.
All right, everybody have one out?
I'm going to hand it to you.
You're going to hand it up to me. And I'm going to keep them and treasure them until I make it to a garbage barrel. No, I would not recycle. I recycle lots. This is a recycled shirt. I wore it once, I didn't throw it away, so I'm wearing it again. It pays to recycle this. The paper, unless someone's paying me for it, it tells me that's trash, not a resource. When you have to pay somebody to take something, that means it's trash. So I won't be recycling it, I'll be throwing it away. Separate lecture, we don't have one on that this week, I don't think. I'm taking a risk doing this with you guys because I'm looking out here and people who self-select to come to a Freedom University here at FEE are an elite group of people who are obviously interested in liberty-type issues, political economy generally. I've never tried this at a summer seminar before with one of you guys, so it might not work, or it might not illustrate exactly what I want, but I've done this with master's level classes, senior level undergrad classes, honors classes, principles classes. I always get the same result. So I'm interested to see if it works with you guys. So what I'd like you to do, first, write whatever state you're from on the top of the paper. You're going to have to write about 6 or 7 things on this paper for me. Next line, I'd like you to write the name, and don't look at other people's papers, you write it down just for yourself. I'd like you to write the name of the current President of the United States. If you don't know, that's okay, just write a question mark. So don't guess on these. If you know, write the name. If you don't know, just put a question mark. Next line, I'd like you to write the Vice President of the United States. Next line after that, please write the Governor of your state. Don't ask, no cheating back there, just for you, just your own work. Line after your governor, I'd like you to write the 2 senators to U.S. Congress. I got to be careful with this language. I don't want to call them your senators. It would be like calling the common thief who mugs you your mugger. So the senator from the state that you're from, the 2 senators from the state that you're from.
To the federal Senate.
To the U.S. Senate. The next line after that, I'd like you to please write the representative to the U.S. House of Representatives from your district. If you don't know it, write a question mark. We're not spending lots of time here. Your next line after that, I'd like you to write, if you have a state senate, like a state level senate, not U.S. level, write the name of the person who currently robs you, who says to be representing you in that office. Final one, last line. Please write down your representative to your U.S. state house, your state house. So if you're from Massachusetts, your representative to the Mass State House. The New York Assembly in the state. Question mark if you don't know. Don't fold these up. I don't want you making your answers all secret because it just means I have to unfold them. Pass them forward. People in the front, wait till it gets up here. I just want to collect them all at once. Send them forward. Send them all up, come on. Like that, let's go. Thank you. All right, everybody, quiet down, back up here. How do you think we did?
Terrible.
There's too many of them here to go through literally everybody's. I'm just going to give you a random sample of them. We'll see how we did. I'll leave the stack up here after if any of you would like to verify the representativeness of it. So we've got someone from Texas. Obama, Vice President Biden, Governor somebody, I'll assume you're right, and then the rest of them question marks, question marks, question marks, question marks. Next one, Obama. Question marks from there on out. Next one, Obama. Question marks down until our senators, and then we have just Mr. and Miss, Mrs. and Mrs. So apparently we know they're female. Obama, question mark. We don't have governors, we have members of parliament. Oh, okay, you're from another country, that's all right. Someone from Minnesota, just Obama. California, Obama, Biden, the Terminator. Feinstein and Boxer, question marks from there on out. We don't have any hundreds yet. Georgia here, Obama, Biden, Sonny Perdue, Senators Chambliss and Price, I'll believe you're right. Question marks after that. Someone who thinks they're funny and they got the first three and then just wrote superheroes after that, which is fine. If I was going to write on a ballot, I might write those names. Obama, Schwarzenegger, and nothing else. Someone who seems to get through their senators, but then question marks after that. I'm trying to find one person who's 100 here. Someone who got down to the bottom two and then question marks, bottom two and then question marks. Only got the top three. You're up. One person ran the table, if you're not lying to me, and I don't recognize any of these names, but that's all right. From Pennsylvania. You guys can tell me if he was lying. Governor Ed Rendell. Casey Inspector for the Senators. Joe Pitts, Chip Brightbill, Dave Hercornell. All right, we've got 100. It took us about 10, 12 people to do it. As I'm flipping through just casually here, I'm seeing tons of question marks. One person who can't follow instructions. Question marks, question marks, question marks, question marks, all over the place. You feel free to look through these on your own. Guys, I started this by saying I thought you were going to be an elite group of students. There's just massive ignorance on the names of who these people are among you. Do you feel embarrassed by this? I wouldn't either. My students usually feel embarrassed by it, and I have to convince them why they shouldn't be. Because you're ignorant about this. But it's rationally ignorant. It makes sense for you to be ignorant of who these criminals' names are. But think about what we need to have a good disciplinary mechanism on them. If we're using elections to punish those who don't do what's in the public interest, we need to know, one, what the right policies are, two, what policies the politicians have supported who are in power or promised to support, and at a minimum, hell, know what their names are to be able to link their name to the policy. Here, with what's probably an elite group of voters, we have massive failure at the name level. Let alone what positions they took on CAFTA, pro or con, and whether, for that matter, CAFTA is a good idea or not. But that's what's required of voters if we're going to use voting as a disciplinary device to ensure that politicians who aren't angels do what's in the public interest. And if I can't get that among you here, what chance do you think that we get this among the general public when they go to the polls? There's massive ignorance. But notice I called it rational ignorance before. That's what economists refer to it as. You're ignorant of something, you don't know it, but it's perfectly rational to be. So it's rational because the cost of being informed are higher than the benefits. So what's one of the costs? What are some of the costs of being an informed voter? Yeah. Time. Time to know their names. That's not a very big cost. But
Compared to the worth.
compared to the worth. We're going to get to the worth in a second. But how about the informed vote? Not just their names, but like to understand the policies, you really should have some systematic training in economics to understand cause and effect chains in this. Also ethics. Maybe even some physical science, and be able to relate this to the policies at hand. That's hard work and time-consuming, when you could have been doing things that are much more fun. Next, you have to watch and pay attention to which politicians do which policies. Not just vote for them, but push their behalf with their colleagues. It's a time-consuming monitoring process. How many laws the federal government passes every year? The growth in the pages of the Federal Register? To have any idea about this stuff would be massively costly in terms of time. You're absolutely right. How about, I mentioned CAFTA, Central American Free Trade Agreement. How many of you know what your representative's position was on that a few years ago? 2. What is CAFTA? Did I just say its name before?
Central American Free Trade Agreement.
Central American Free Trade Agreement. So you freedom-loving people in the room here, sounds like a great idea, right?
Nope.
Free trade agreement. I like free trade. Don't you like free trade? That's why we have things like free trade agreement, Patriot Act. Who doesn't like patriots? At least the football team. No, and what he pointed out, what I just heard in front of me from Jacob, it's not a free trade agreement. Do you know how many pages it was?
like 1,500 on the tariff rate specifically.
Just on that. I think the overall was like in the over 10,000 pages. Does it take that to write a free trade? I'm not positive on that. Someone fact check that one later. But point is, it's thousands of pages.
It is.
How many pages do you need for a free trade agreement?
Yeah.
It would go something like, I agree not to tax or put quotas on your stuff if you won't do it to mine. And then maybe I need like one page where I can write about regulatory non-discrimination, so that basically you can't use regulations against my stuff, like requiring all of my cars to be lower emissions than your domestic cars, just, to make it uniform. You maybe need one page for that. That's it. When it's that long, it's not a free trade agreement. It'll have some things that might free trade. It'll have other things that restrict it. So like in CAFTA's, like garments can come into the United States from these countries tariff-free, if, however, the thread that produced the garments first came from the United States and went to them. So there's all of these like bizarre little catches in the whole thing. And I'll get to one of the other major areas that it glosses over in a few minutes. So the point is here, it's extremely costly to learn about all of these policies. What's the benefit? Remember, methodologically individualistic. What's the benefit of casting an informed vote? Who said it? Where? You don't get robbed as much. So maybe you're casting an informed vote and saying, tax me less. Is that a benefit of your vote? Problem is, when we start thinking, because remember, public choice, methodologically individuals, people act on perceived costs and benefits to themselves. Now, it's true that if everybody voted for lower taxes, you might get lower taxes. And that would be a benefit. Pretty big benefit. But do you control whether everybody else votes or not? You control only... Sorry to all you in internet land. You control only your vote. So what are the perceived benefits of your vote for lower taxes? Well, for your vote to actually have a benefit in terms of changing outcome of election, you need a situation where your vote is the tipping point and breaks a tie. Otherwise, the marginal benefit of your vote was at precisely zero, because you got the same policy as you would have got whether you voted or didn't vote. So for your vote to have an effect in changing the outcome of an election, which is making another assumption that the outcome of election actually is going to determine what the policy change is, but let's grant that for now. Let's abstract from the Electoral College for just a second. So let's just think, President of the United States, we do it in a popular vote. There's roughly 300 million people in the United States. Roughly 150 million of them are registered to vote. In any given election, about half of those vote. That's about 75 million people. For your vote to have a marginal benefit, the election would have to be exactly 37,500,000 to 37,500,000. And when you go to the polling place, push your little punch card or pull your lever, it becomes 37,500,000 and 1. What do you think the probability of that happening is? Pretty small. In fact, like if I were going to put a decimal point here in the front of the room and start writing zeros, I'd probably have to make multiple laps around the room before I could put a 1. It's essentially 0. So even if there was a huge difference in the candidates, awesome candidate who is going to give you whatever your ideal form of government is, and Joe Stalin. So there's a huge amount at stake. But multiplied by a probability of essentially 0, your marginal expected benefit to yourself is still just about 0, but yet you'd have to engage in the cost to learn about candidates and policies. That means most people are rationally ignorant of who their candidates are, what positions their candidates take, what the effect of the policies would be, because their vote simply doesn't change the outcome. In the same way that you're not irrational when you go to the supermarket to buy a box of cereal. There, you're spending the dollar, you completely get the marginal benefit of that or not, of your good decision or bad decision. In this case, you get essentially no benefits from making good decisions, but all costs. So people are rationally ignorant when they go to the polling place. That's not good for society. It gets you bad policies. But it does make sense individualistically. Your vote will not change the outcome of the election. Now, people will say other things to me because they'll say, are you saying not to vote? Not necessarily. I'm saying don't vote because you think you're changing the outcome of an election. You're not. You're going to get the same outcome, at least in a national election. Maybe find me a city council race. You can find somewhere where a close race, you have a not significantly close to zero probability of getting a tie. But other than that, national elections, you're not going to change the outcome. So what might you want to do? You might want to signal. So you want to signal support for an alternative. So I'm sure you've all met people who would say, oh, well, I would have voted for, say, Libertarian candidate or Ron Paul or whoever, but I didn't want to waste my vote. I wanted to do it to somebody who could win. Well, now you have one response, which is, your vote's not going to change the outcome anyway. Might as well signal for who you want. Second thought, though, is, if you really care about signaling, what's the marginal impact of your signal? Like, yeah, it is a big deal when a third-party candidate gets a few million votes. But you're still only controlling one of those votes by going to the polling place. So like, who's like, oh, look, Ron Paul got 1,000,001 votes. Who wouldn't be equally impressed by 1,000,000? Again, on the margin, signal's very small. Other people will say they feel it's their civic duty or whatever. Cool, you got those feelings, go for it. My boss, he says he votes because he wouldn't want to have to admit to his grandchildren that he didn't try to fight against the oppression that was coming. And I point out to him that there's ways that have a point that you can fight against it, and there's pointless ways. Why are you choosing a pointless way? But anyhow, vote because you like pushing the little punch cards. Vote because you like being part of the collective experience. Don't do it because you think you're changing the outcome. You're probably not. But the implication of this, and I assume I'll get some questions on this later. So I'll admit it now. Maybe this will make some of you, hopefully you won't think I'm a bad person. I don't vote. And I'm going to get one of those stickers someday that just says, I didn't vote. And I'll wear it all on election day so I can teach people about public choice when they think I'm a bad person. In fact, so another reason to vote for lots of people is you don't want to have to say at a cocktail party when someone asks you, who'd you vote for? Oh, I didn't vote. I actually take pride in saying, no, I didn't vote for any of those jerks. And then I proceed to explain to them why. So while you're ignorant of these things, the general public's ignorant of a lot of these policies. Let's make it concrete for a second. So I'll go back to CAFTA. One thing exempted from the Central American Free Trade Agreement is sugar. The United States could maintain its sugar quotas. Sugar quotas keep foreign sugar out of the United States to the effect of making the U.S. price of sugar about twice the world market price of sugar. So as a result, all of your other products that use sugar are more expensive here, candy, etc. And they also change their nature. So like Coca-Cola, anybody ever drank a Coke in another country? Tastes a little different. It's made with sugar. In the United States, it's made with high fructose corn syrup. That's in response to U.S. sugar quotas. It used to be made with sugar in the United States. That slowly started changing in the early 1980s and evolved over a period of 3 or 4 years where they eventually phased it all out. And I drink like 2-3 Cokes a day, so this like really bugs me about the sugar quotas. Like basically my body functions on Coke in the morning and alcohol sometime afternoon on. It's like, and then I go to a foreign country and it's like, oh, I got to adjust to a new formula. So I bet most of you didn't know that sugar was exempted from this, or that it was twice the world market price here in the United States. And maybe you noticed Coke tasted different, but didn't know why and when it started happening. Who do you think knows an awful lot about sugar quotas? The sugar industry in the United States. Sugar beet growers and sugar cane growers in the United States. In particular, the Funjul family in southern Florida. They're one of the biggest sugar producers in the United States. And sugar is a very concentrated industry in the United States, more so than a lot of the other agricultural products. These sugar producers know all about sugar quotas and what was going to be in the content of CAFTA, and they lobby aggressively. They are representatives in Congress and others to make sure sugar isn't excluded. For them, there's millions and millions and millions, possibly even billions, of dollars at stake. So not only are they informed about it and vote accordingly, what else they do is donate money to the campaigns of all of the politicians who will support maintaining sugar quotas. In the Funjul family's case, they donate to their lobbying associations of sugar growers of Florida and the national one, who then go ahead and make contributions. As a company, they make contributions. And then individuals within the family, the 2 main brothers who own it, but also their sisters, their children, their nephews, whoever, all make contributions to various politicians in support of this, both Republican and Democrat. The politicians, do they take this money and then say, okay, well, we'll make sure that all the voters know about it, so we'll spend the money and say, sugar quotas are good for America, and we'll run an ad on our campaign about this? No. What if they run an ad with like someone, petting a dog or something like that, right? Everyone's like, oh, kissing a baby, whatever. Meanwhile, they're talking about sugar quotas with one person who gives you money, and then they just do some sort of generic thing that voters do care about because voters base their votes on bad information anyway, bad and cheap to acquire information, so they give you some of it. As a result, though, what's happened is, not only are we rationally ignorant as a general voter base, but the particular interests who have a lot at stake in any one policy, they're not ignorant, and they do something about it. As a result, we create a logic of politics, which is concentrate benefits, disperse costs. So actually, Mansur Olson calls it logic of collective action. Concentrate benefits, disperse costs. So if we create policies where we concentrate the benefits on just a few people, but then we disperse the cost across the whole country so everybody's just paying pennies, the voters will remain rationally ignorant about it. I mean, the sugar quotas probably cost each of you in the realm of a few dollars annually. So you don't bother finding out about it. Basically, even if your vote made a difference, it's not worth the information cost to find out about a policy that only cost you a few dollars. So you remain ignorant. Meanwhile, you create people who have a vested interest in making sure you advance in politics and giving you money to do things that will influence the mass of ignorant voters by making cheap signals to them of whatever it is that they do penalize you for or reward you for. So he calls this the logic of collective action. And in the United States, it's very obvious when you look at elections, they're intensely competitive. I mean, have you seen the pictures of what happened to Barack Obama from the beginning of the campaign to the end in terms of his hairline and the amount of gray in his hair? I think it was actually great. They've done like the imaging of it. He was working hard during that competition. No doubt about it. There's vigorous competition at most levels of government in the United States to see who's the one who gets the position of power. The problem is, in that vigorous competition, the rules of the game are such that what it benefits politicians to do is create bad policies. Policies that on net make society poorer, but they make everybody poorer just a little bit, and they make one individual or a group of individuals very much better off, but not enough so to offset the total loss. So policies that on net make society poorer, but benefit specific individuals, help you get ahead. Let's say you're a not particularly evil politician, and you don't want to play this game. You say, no, I went to Fees Freedom University. I've learned from Tony that inflation is bad, and I'm going to run on an anti-inflation or whatever plank. And you start encountering competition. Maybe you win at the state or local level because you're charismatic. You kissed everybody's dog in the neighborhood, and shook everybody's grandmother. Whatever. No. Patted the dog, kissed the grandmother, whatever. And you win there. But as you start advancing to higher levels, what do you think happens? You start encountering people who are equally as charismatic and hardworking and put their feet to the pavement and go out and pound hands with everybody. And you start finding, what margin can I outcompete them on? In order to get ahead, you eventually have to start playing the game of concentrate benefits, disperse costs. Otherwise, you find somebody who gets ahead of you in the game. You simply get selected out. Hayek talks about this in The Road to Serfdom, about government generally. He calls it why the worst get on top. For those people who would only do the honorable thing, say not violating somebody's rights or wanting to promote the policy of the general interest, it would have to be an amazing coincidence that every point in their career competition to get towards the top, that doing what's right coincides with doing what will get them elected. If it doesn't coincide like that, they're going to run into people who are willing to sacrifice what is right or efficient or just in order to get ahead. And Hayek says this is automatically going to sort as a mechanism to put only the worst people on top. Only the most mischievous, the least moral, the ones you wouldn't want to even babysit your dog, are the ones who end up being a president of the United States or other countries. This is a problematic part of the competition, but it's the nature of the beast of how it's organized. So we have this problem of the logic of collective action, concentrating benefits, dispersing costs. We also have other problems going on besides that. So let's say for a moment that that's not the current problem. We've got somebody who just wants to do what the will of the voters is. Is it even clear what the will of the voters is? Well, here's a little example. We'll have Ben, Tony, and Sheldon up here. And we're the three voters, and we can vote on policies A, B, and C. And let's say A is the cool right policy that's would roll government back and make you all freer. B is like subsidize the My Little Pony industry. And C is something else entirely. It doesn't really matter. So there's my preference order ranking of it. And Tony, he's got slightly different preferences than me. He would prefer the My Little Pony subsidization most, then C, and then A last. Sheldon, conversely, favors C, then A, and then B last, because he doesn't like ponies. If we said, what is the will of the voters here? And we put these three alternative policies, we can only do one of the policies, up for election. Which is the will of the voters? Well, let's try it. So we run A against B. Who's going to win? Well, I've got my first choice. I'll vote for my first choice. Tony's got his first choice. He'll vote for his first choice. Sheldon doesn't have his first choice on the ballot, so you're stuck in this kind of Demopublican world. And he chooses his second choice, A. So A wins 2-1. So A must be the preferred policy compared to B. So let's check out how C does compared to A then to make sure we haven't just excluded an irrelevant alternative. So I'd still vote for A, my favorite. Tony no longer has the ponies, so he's stuck going down to his second choice, which is C. Sheldon now has his first choice, so he gets C. C wins 2-1 against A. So C is preferred to A is preferred to B. So that means C must be the best policy, right? We better check. Let's try C and B against each other. I don't have my first choice. I do have my second, so I choose that. Tony has his first choice. He chooses B. Sheldon's left alone at C. Now B's preferred to C. So B must be the best policy, right? Oh wait, we got to check it against A. This is called cycling, where you can keep cycling through the different alternatives. And with realistic assumptions about what people will have preferences over in politics, cycling can be a real problem if they have any sort of multi-peak preferences. So it doesn't mean on all issues you necessarily have an intransitivity here, but it means it's quite possible for it to develop in democracy where there's no even clear, unambiguous, quote, will of the majority, assuming the politicians would do whatever that will is. Another question to ask, even if the voters could clearly say what their will is, remember what we said to get politics to give us the efficient or the just, which are equally important in my mind, maybe not even equally, which are both very important in my mind, solution to a particular policy? We need the politicians to be disciplined to do what the voters want. The voters have to understand what policies the politicians support. And finally, they have to know themselves what the efficient or just policy is. So even if we could get the will of the voters, is there anybody in here who thinks that the will of the voters would be something that looks at all like an optimal society? The voters are not just massively ignorant about who their politicians are and what the policies are, they're massively ignorant about what are the general policies that promote prosperity. That means even if they're getting their way, we often end up with really bad policies. In fact, another friend of mine who's lectured at FEE, he lectured at FEE last year with me actually, Brian Kaplan, has just come out with a very important book, probably the most important book the last 15 years or so in public choice. It's called The Myth of the Rational Voter. And he takes the idea of rational ignorance a step farther. He says, people aren't just rationally ignorant about policies. He calls them rationally irrational, which sounds a bit strange. Rationally irrational. How could you be rationally irrational? He says, well, listen, they have not just preferences about outcomes, but preferences over beliefs about outcomes. So, and you've all encountered this before, it's fairly intuitive. Have you ever talked to somebody about a topic where they don't really know very much about it, and you try to just explain some fairly non-controversial factual things that would help them improve their view of some economic cause and effect, or religious, that would do it too? And instead of saying, oh, thank you, that helps me understand better, they get mad at you without actually making a counter-argument. They just get mad. This is telling you, not only do they want a particular policy to have causes, they just want to believe it. And you shattering some of their belief about that hurts their own happiness. So voters indulge in having these beliefs that make them feel happy that might not be true. And what Brian's pointing out is here, they have, in a micro sense, a costless way to indulge them. So when you go to the voting booth, since the probability of your vote changing the outcome is essentially zero, indulge your irrational beliefs. If you want to believe free trade impoverishes nations, it's a free way to indulge it there. You might not indulge it when you go to the store, because then it's costly. But when you go to the voting booth, since you're not changing the outcome anyway, go ahead, satisfy that belief. But then what we're getting is irrational policies, not because the evil politicians hijacked it or created concentrated benefits and dispersed costs, but because the voters are morons in terms of the policies they want, precisely because they get happiness from the moronic views. And what Brian goes through, and what Brian calls it, although he's not bashful about calling it extreme voter stupidity, I don't know if I've heard him use the word moronic before, he calls it extreme voter stupidity. He's replying to one of the critics of traditional public choice literature, Donald Whitman, who had said with extreme competition there, he says, in order to generate the inefficient outcomes people are claiming, what you need is systematically biased beliefs, which you could translate from economist jargon to extreme voter stupidity. And what Brian says, everybody always wants to say, oh no, I'm not assuming irrationality about people. And he says, I'm quite comfortable with it. He says, let's look at the world and try to document it. We've got this kind of intuitive feel that people have it, systematically biased beliefs. And in fact, as teachers, as an economics teacher, I certainly believe my students have systematically biased beliefs. When they come into a classroom of Econ 101 with no prior training, I don't think that they, on net, are going to be more favorable to free trade than less, or as favorable as they should be. It's not going to be an even distribution of beliefs. I think they're going to be biased. So I start trying to work to correct that. And I think most of us do as teachers. So Brian goes through and he documents a number of biases where there's just firm things that you can compare statistical survey results from the people to the actual reality in the world and show how off the views are and not just off randomly. Because if everybody was, if everybody was completely rational ignorant, that the rational ignorance was completely random, and you could have people varying both on the for and against side of what the correct policy is, so that's problematic on something like free trade. If you have any sort of if free trade is the optimal policy, it would be hard to have somebody who wants too freer trade to cancel some of the people who want less free trade. So that doesn't really work there. But if you had something where the policy could have dispersion to either side, if it were completely random, the ignorant votes would cancel itself out and the 1% who actually knows the answer would drive the outcome. Problem disappears, and that was what Whitman was driving at. I think there's other responses to Whitman. One, like I said about free trade, when your optimal policy is a corner solution, you don't get that type of result. The other that Brian says is, no, the distribution of errors by people is systematically skewed, so that's what the political process drives you towards. And one of the reasons for this is they like to indulge in their irrationality in this format because it is costless for them, although extremely costly for society. Reading H.L. Mencken, actually this morning before I left to come here, I saw just a great quote that goes along this from Mencken talking about politicians and how they compete. And when I use the word mob in this paragraph, he's referring to the general population and the voters, not any organizations of crime, well, not any official criminal organizations. Quote, the only way to success in American public life lies in flattering and kowtowing to the mob. A candidate for office, even the highest office, must either adopt its current manias and block or convince it hypocritically that he has done so while cherishing reservations in petto. The result is that only two sorts of men stand any chance whatever of getting into control of affairs. First, glorified mob men who genuinely believe what the mob believes. And secondly, shrewd fellows who are willing to make any sacrifice of conviction and self-respect in order to hold their jobs. So there's two types of competition here of getting ahead. And I think two types of democratic failure. I actually view Brian's work as a complement to the logic of collective action rather than a substitute. Brian tries to make them more opposing in his talks. I think they're both explanations for why we get inefficient government policies. So you've got one sort of selection of Hayek style, why the worst get on top, and it's the logic of politics concentrating behind its dispersing costs in order that they can get the funds to run their campaigns. And for that matter, you don't need it. It's not just simply campaign funding. Hayek doesn't make his argument contingent on that at all. But you have that type of selection mechanism going on. And then simultaneously, you have to satisfy the mobs on what their irrational beliefs are, at least to some extent. Otherwise, you're not going to get their votes. So while they're rationally ignorant, they do have these biases and beliefs that you have to cater to. And for the most part, a lot of the interest groups politics, the logic of collective action, moves on margins that voters are ignorant of or fairly indifferent about, whereas other things the voters do care about. The politicians, Mencken style here, cater to the mob like crazy. So I think you have both of these types of failure going on at once. One where you're successfully picking the buffoons to lead the buffoons, as Mencken might say it, and another where the evil guys are getting ahead of the good-spirited guys. I think both of these things are happening simultaneously and getting us our current political results. So really what we have when we talk, it's kind of odd because economists quite often, if they're going to give a justification for government, they'll say government needs to exist to fix public goods problems. Public good problem where basically the social benefits of doing something exceed the private benefits, so people individually wouldn't do it. Ironically, good government policy itself is the ultimate public good. The private cost of making well-informed votes is a public benefit to the rest of society, but it's a private cost to you. So if your justification for government is public goods, it's rather ironic that you'd pick a mechanism to run the government that is itself a giant public good problem. I can see everybody's feeling very uplifted here towards the end of the day. Is there anything good I can say about democracy? Yes. So at the beginning, I also said our question is comparative institutional. We have to compare it, any sort of political economy question, to what are other attainable real-world systems. And I certainly think there are things that you could do that are superior to democracy. One obvious one is cutting back on the scope of what democracies are involved with. Basically, getting the state out of so many things so that the selection mechanism you're using to run it is pulled into a tighter sphere. That's one start. But compared to other systems that are being used in the world in a lot of places right now, like, say, dictatorship, while there's massive ignorance in a democracy, ignorance in dictatorship is often much worse. And they have even less control over the jackbooted people who run their lives. So it's got something going for that. Historically, when you look at it, democracies are less likely to mass murder large chunks of its own population compared to dictatorships. I mean, if you think Stalin had to go up for re-election, could he have ever mass murdered the Ukraine? Probably get a pretty big voter bloc mobilized against you. Along with that, mass starvations. Other economists have done work, a lot of research showing mass starvations virtually never happens in democracies, even poor democracies. But it does happen much more often in poor dictatorships. So when it comes to like really bad outcomes, democracies, by having a larger encompassing interest, and by voters, while they're rationally ignorant of lots of things, like if you saw the Gulag being set up next door and millions of American subjects being funneled into it, you might react against that in the polling place. You might not understand the complexities of CAFTA, but you kind of get that. So it constrains really bad outcomes from governments that are less constrained in other places. So I think that's something positive. Ultimately, do I have any hope for freedom while you're using this, what I'd think of as poor incentive system to govern so much? Yeah. A lot of it requires different type of civic capital than the current American population has. You can look through the United States history and see times when we had the same form of government, but it was much less status than it is today. And I think at the same time, the ideology of the American people, a sort of rugged individualism, was much more prevalent in prior times than today. And increasingly that erodes, and as it does, so do the results of your elections. Really what you need is more civil society capital that demands liberty and doesn't require a whole lot of thinking about it to drive those conclusions. Like when you went to somebody in 1820 and asked them about the effects of a certain government policy, you probably weren't likely to get a complicated economic answer. In fact, you couldn't get one that depended on marginal values, a foundation of economics, because economists weren't working in marginal values then. So they were ignorant of the policies too, in a sense. But they also had a more quick and dirty reference point that got them the approximately right answer, and that's no, that's violating our rights. Don't do it. To the extent that societies hold those type of values, politicians are low-cost monitored, because it's easier to detect that than it is what's the efficient twist on CAFTA. Basically, if we treat violations of freedom as voters the same way they treat having sex with your intern, then democracy will give you good results. They don't need lots of sordid details of the affair. They just need to know, Chandra Levy disappears, and her senator had been having a relationship with her. He gets booted. When you start treating free trade that way, democracy will push you more towards free trade, and for that matter, curtailing future democracy and saying that that stuff's just going to be off the table. Basically, we need to change an ideology among the citizens. I think that also explains why some democracies, why not all democracies are equally bad. Some are relatively better than others. Unfortunately, America happens to be one of what I would call the tallest dwarves in the world. It's not as bad as some of the other democracies, and I think it's because there is more of that individualistic American cultural heritage still left in our population than there is in others. So I think there is some hope on this, but we shouldn't naively think that democracy alone gets us there, and in fact, it sets up a major hurdle in that process. And it also implies something about when we go to other countries and are recommending reforms, what other countries need is capitalism. Unfortunately, what the US government most often does when they go there is they say, oh, you need democracy. But democracy without even the level of civic capital that the United States have isn't going to get you good results. It's going to get you the same bad results they were getting before. So a lot of the battle is an educational battle for places here like Foundation for Economic Education to teach people better economics that they hold politicians accountable for at relatively low cost to themselves, and two, promoting a more general ideology that has lower cost ways of identifying when these people need to be punished, which is pretty much every day they walk into their office. So with that, I will open it up for questions. Yeah, first hand.
Two-part question. One, the United States, up until I think it was 1912 or so, had the United States Senate appointed by the legislative of the state, and of each state individually. Was that a better system? Was that less responsive to the mob? And the second question is, the opposition leader in Great Britain just proposed that they go into fixed terms rather than having parliamentary elections called whenever there was a vote of no confidence. Would that be more democratic or less? Those are my two questions.
Okay, so two questions. Let me do the first one, and then so the first question was, the United States used to have state legislators elect the U.S. senators as opposed to the general population. Did this help insulate it from the mob? I think it certainly helped, yes. And I think that was, the Founding Fathers, in some sense, were concerned with mob rule. And they wanted to try to restrict the mob rule of getting in there. And one of the important ways they were trying to do that was by having the state legislators elect the senators. Also then, because if you just want to put power against power, states like power too. And now if they're the ones electing their people to the Senate who are accountable to them and they like to have their power, they need to get elected by them to have it, that's going to make them more skeptical of increasing federal power relative to state. So I think it's an institutional check that helps. I don't think it solves the problem. So I certainly view institutions as matter. That they matter. They change relative cost and benefits on the margin like this and make mob rule more likely in this case. But ultimately, the state legislators are elected themselves by the mob too. And the mob elects the people who sets the overall rules for the game, or for that matter, constitutional referenda that change those rules of the game anyway. So I kind of view ideology is really the driving force. Institutions operate within margins of where the general ideology sits, but major ideological shifts, you're going to shift your institutions either formally, like we did in that case, or, quite frankly, informally, the way the Supreme Court does all the time of interpreting what the rules supposedly say, and everybody goes along with it because it fits their general ideology. The second question, Britain going to a system of fixed elections instead of being able to recall a parliament whenever, is that more democratic? I don't know if I want to call it. One thing is the problem is defining democracy. I've used the term fairly loosely in here. Was the United States, so in fact, this was a question Gordon Tullock, one of the founders of Public Choice, used to like to pose when I have him in class. Give me a definition of democracy. Tell me why democracy is good without using the definition of democratic. And then also, what is a democracy? Was the United States a democracy when it was founded? Oh, okay, some of you want to use definitional of Republican. Well, people voted. White male property owners voted. Is that democratic? So we can have direct democracy, or we can have Republican forms of democracy. There's still voting by people. What if only 5% of the people vote? Let's say make it a direct democracy, forget the republic part of it, but only 5% vote. Is that a democracy? I don't know. What if 50% do? What if 40% do? And if you said okay at 5%, well, what if it's only the 10 people on the Politburo who vote? Is that a democracy? Clearly the answer becomes no. It's kind of squishy where we define this. More democratic? I don't know. It means they might have elections more often or less often. I don't know if there's a certain regularity of elections for our definition of democratic in a meaningful way in terms of economic outcomes. So I guess I don't know. Yeah?
Do you advocate an elitist voting system?
The question is, do I advocate an elitist voting system?
Essentially the informed vote, leaving the rest of the individuals to live with whatever the decision of the elitist group is.
Yeah, no, I get the question. Do I advocate one? As in, do I go around saying we should have an elitist voter system? No, because I'm really not in favor of that either. However, do I think it would be better than what we currently have? Maybe, depending how we define elitist.
Yeah.
I think if we went to a system where, how about elitist voting system where if you're a net tax consumer, you can't vote? That's an elitist one, but now it's if you're paying for the things that are being provided to everybody on net, you get a say, but otherwise you don't. How about if we just go to the old distinction, property owners versus non-property? That's a different elitist system. Probably. Would I also say would we be better off if they just let, for all of their problems, and God knows they have plenty of them, an economist voting system? Do I think would have more rational policy? Yeah. So I think lots of elitist voting systems could be better on the margin, but that's not what I'd advocate. I'd advocate restricting what the franchise is able to say anything about. Simply, it's not yours to make decisions about. So I'd rather get the irrationality to as smaller realm as possible, ideally.
So you would eliminate the ability for us to vote on many issues and let the individual choose for himself.
Yeah, and the problem, of course, with that is, in order to make that type of change in our society, you need to convince the majority of individuals that they don't need to be voting about other people's lives and joint issues nearly as much. And that's the transaction problem of going from here to there, which I think nobody has great solutions to the social change problem. Clearly, one part of it is education, which is why I like talking about these things. But there's certainly not a clear a priori path of what's the best way from here to there. But in the meantime, some version of the elitist system might get us better results. Off in the periphery, yeah.
Hey, do you have an opinion on the current increasing judicial power that's being taken by the judicial system? And if so, how does that involve the public? Is that good, bad?
I don't really, actually.
Can you repeat the question?
The question was, do I have an opinion on the increasing power of the judicial branch of government? I don't have a strong opinion on it. There's certainly cases where, and it might be the case that on net more of the judicial quote activism recently has been for the worse, but there can be cases when it's better too. I don't see it as the major driver of what's bringing the country in the wrong direction, and I think it's been happening for a lot longer than that. When it comes to the checks and balances overall, economists who I like a great deal, Murray Rothbard, said a lot about this, and he says the whole idea really doesn't hold water. It's like, yes, the Supreme Court's supposed to constrain the president and the judiciary and all vice versa. He's like, but they're all part of the same government. They all benefit from its growth together. So entrusting them to limit each other is kind of silly. If I had thought of it beforehand, I would have got a direct quote. There's a great quote on it out of For a New Liberty on that topic. So I just don't view the separate. Again, like the separation on the margin, it's probably a plus. but I don't think it's a huge deal. Yeah.
I agree with you when you talk about voting, how it only makes a difference if it's a tiebreaker. But on the other hand, isn't that kind of like saying a referee in a basketball game he shouldn't make any calls unless it's a game-changing, like a change in the score to change the game, the outcome of the game? Because if that applies, if that's the truth, then we should all just not vote. Then go tell it to Democrats and Republicans will win every time, because they'll just all stop voting.
Okay, so the analogy doesn't hold though. So the question is it like saying a referee shouldn't blow his whistle unless it's a game-changing call because it wouldn't change the outcome of the game? It does change the outcome of the game on the margin. So each time they blow the whistle, it makes the probability of the outcome different, right? So their whistle blow, it's not like they whistle blow and then there's some small probability it's going to change the flow of the game. Every time they blow their whistle, it changes what the next play in the game is going to be. So it might not be, so I guess what your analogy is doing is it's saying change the outcome of the game as meaning who wins and loses, like in an absolute sense, as opposed to just each individual battle within the game. So like, I think the analogy to make it go back to politics would have to be more like, so say you could roll back the income tax by 1%. That wouldn't get rid of it entirely. Shouldn't we do it? With 100% probability that you could roll it back 1%, let's say it does. There's a 100% probability that when that ref blows his whistle, he's going to make a call that impacts the game. My point is, you make no impact with your vote, even in a signaling sense, on the margin. He makes an impact in the signal when he blows his whistle because it changes the next play of the game. Your vote doesn't change the next action of the other political players.
But actually, different states can impact. People can vote based on other states, how they're going. I mean, and
yeah, sure, but so what?
Votes count.
Oh.
Oklahoma doesn't, but other states count.
Okay, so we can run that probability then. So we can say if you're in New Hampshire in the primaries, your vote matters more than somebody in, I don't know, whoever the last primary is. True, it matters more because you are going to be sending the collective vote of your state is going to send some signal to everybody else. However, again, the question is, on the margin, you in New Hampshire, how much of a marginal change in New Hampshire's overall vote do you make? The answer is still pretty damn close to zero. Once you start getting down to like city councils and stuff, you can approach